In June 1864, a British Army officer named Henry Fletcher stood in a field outside Petersburg, Virginia, watching something that horrified him. American soldiers were digging, not just digging trenches for a temporary position, but creating an elaborate network of fortifications, zigzagging communication trenches, reinforced firing positions, underground bunkers. They were settling in for a siege that would last 9 months. Fletcher had seen sieges before. Every European officer had studied the great sieges of military history. But this was different. This wasn't armies surrounding a fortress. This was two field armies, face to face, digging into the earth because the weapons had become so deadly that standing up meant death. He wrote in his journal that night that he was watching the future of warfare, and he was terrified. Fletcher wasn't alone. Scattered across American battlefields between 1861 and 1865, European military observers were witnessing a revolution in warfare. They saw rifled muskets that could kill at 500 yards instead of 50. They watched ironclad ships make wooden navies obsolete in a single afternoon. They documented battles where 7,000 men fell in 20 minutes. They took notes as soldiers instinctively started fighting from cover and digging trenches because the alternative was suicide. And then they went home and tried to warn their governments that everything had changed. Almost no one listened. 50 years later, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army suffered 60,000 casualties in a single day. Officers sent men in parade ground formations across open ground into machine gun fire. The same mistakes the observers had warned about, the same lessons that had been written down, filed away, and forgotten. In this video, we're going to follow 3 military observers who came to America, saw the future, and spent the rest of their careers trying to convince Europe that war had fundamentally changed. We'll see what they witnessed, read what they wrote, and understand why Europe refused to believe them until it was far too late. This is the story of prophets without honor. Let's start with how they ended up in America in the first place. By 1861, every major European military was asking the same question. How was industrial technology changing warfare? The Crimean War from 1854 to 1856 had given some hints. Rifled muskets were more deadly than smoothbore weapons. Railways could move armies faster than ever before. But the war had been fought mostly by pre-industrial Russia against industrializing Britain and France. The lessons were incomplete. Then the American Civil War broke out, and suddenly Europe had the perfect laboratory. The Union North was more industrialized than most of Europe. Both sides would field massive armies. The conflict was clearly going to be long and intense. If industrialization was going to transform warfare, it would happen in America first, so they sent observers. Every major European power dispatched military officers to watch and report. Some were official missions with diplomatic status. Others were junior officers taking leave to satisfy their curiosity. A few were journalists who happened to have military backgrounds. They came with different agendas. The British worried about future conflict with America over Canada. The Prussians were studying how democratic armies fought compared to professional ones. The French were interested in logistics and industrial warfare. The Austrians and Russians were supposed to be learning but were too resistant to reform to care much. But 3 men stand out for what they saw and what they tried to do with that knowledge. The first was Captain Justus Scheibert of the Prussian Royal Engineers. He was 28 years old when he arrived in America in 1862, a professional soldier from a military family. Prussia sent him specifically because he was an engineer. They wanted technical assessments of American fortifications, artillery, and military infrastructure. Scheibert spent most of his time with the Confederate Army, partly because Prussia's conservative aristocracy was more comfortable with the South's planter class, partly because he got access to Robert E. Lee's headquarters. He would witness some of the war's most important battles and develop a complicated relationship with what he saw. He admired the soldiers, but was disturbed by the carnage. The second was Colonel François Ferri-Pisani, a French cavalry officer and military writer. He came to America in 1861 as part of France's official observer mission. Unlike Scheibert, Ferri-Pisani focused on the Union Army. He was particularly interested in how America's democratic citizen soldiers compared to Europe's professional armies. Ferri-Pisani was a progressive officer who believed that future wars would be total wars involving entire populations, not just professional armies. He came to America looking for evidence to support his theories. He would find more than he bargained for. The third was Lieutenant Colonel Henry Fletcher of the British Army. He arrived later than the others in 1864, when the war had already evolved significantly. Fletcher came with a specific mission from the British War Office: assess whether the United States Army posed a threat to British Canada. What made Fletcher different was his background. Unlike most British officers of his era, he hadn't purchased his commission. He'd worked his way up, from the ranks based on merit. He was a professional soldier who believed in military education and training, not aristocratic tradition. This would shape how he interpreted what he saw. 3 men, 3 armies, 3 different perspectives. But they would all reach remarkably similar conclusions about what they were witnessing. And they would all face remarkably similar resistance when they tried to share those conclusions with their governments. The question is, what did they see that scared them so much? Justus Scheibert's baptism by fire came at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862. He stood on Mary's Heights with Confederate artillery crews, looking down at the town and the open ground beyond. Robert E. Lee's army held the high ground in a nearly perfect defensive position. The Union Army under Ambrose Burnside was preparing to attack across open terrain, up a slope, into fortified positions. Scheibert had studied the great battles of European history: Austerlitz, Waterloo, Solferino. He knew what happened when armies attacked prepared positions. Usually, concentrated artillery disrupted the defenders, then infantry advanced in tight formations, and cavalry finished the job. Battles were decided in hours, sometimes minutes. Fredericksburg would teach him that American battles were different. The Union attack began with artillery bombardment, but the Confederate positions were too well protected to be disrupted. Then the Union infantry advanced, not in the tight columns Scheibert expected, but in loose formations spread across the field. They moved from cover to cover, using buildings and terrain features to shield themselves. It didn't matter. The Confederate position was too strong. Wave after wave of Union soldiers advanced. Wave after wave fell. The famous stone wall at the base of Mary's Heights became a killing ground. Union soldiers got close enough to touch it but couldn't get over it. The battle lasted all day. At the end, over 12,000 Union soldiers were casualties. The Confederates lost fewer than 5,000. The Union never came close to breaking the Confederate line. Scheibert was impressed by Confederate marksmanship and defensive positioning. But what struck him most was what didn't happen. There was no decisive moment, no cavalry charge that broke the enemy, no bayonet assault that carried the position, just hours of soldiers shooting at each other with rifles accurate enough to kill at distances that made Napoleonic tactics obsolete. He wrote in his report that the American rifle had completely changed the nature of battle. In European conflicts, soldiers carried smoothbore muskets accurate to maybe 50 yards. You could march men in tight formations because the enemy couldn't hit you until you were close. Then you charged with bayonets and the battle was decided. But American soldiers carried rifled muskets accurate to 500 yards. You couldn't march men in tight formations anymore because they'd be shot down long before they reached the enemy. And you couldn't charge with bayonets across 500 yards of open ground. The weapon had changed, but the tactics hadn't, and the result was slaughter. Scheibert watched it happen again at Chancellorsville in May 1863. Different battle, same pattern. Enormous casualties. Indecisive results despite tactical victories. Soldiers fighting from behind trees and field fortifications because standing in the open was suicide. Then came Gettysburg in July 1863. Scheibert was there for all 3 days, watching from the Confederate side. He saw the fighting in the Peach Orchard and Devil's Den on the second day. Close-range combat in broken terrain where soldiers couldn't see each other until they were feet apart. Nothing like the open field battles of Europe. On the third day, he witnessed Pickett's charge. Confederate General Robert E. Lee ordered 2,500 men to march across 3/4 of a mile of open ground and attack the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. Scheibert knew what was going to happen before it started. The range was too long. The Union position was too strong. The men would be shot down before they reached the enemy line. He was right. The charge lasted less than an hour. Half the attacking force became casualties. The few who reached the Union line were quickly killed or captured. It was, Scheibert wrote, magnificent but doomed. European tactics applied to American weapons with predictable, horrific results. But here's what disturbed Scheibert most. The soldiers knew it was doomed, too. They weren't stupid. They'd been fighting for 2 years. They understood what modern rifles could do. The officers ordering the charge knew it was probably impossible. They did it anyway because European military doctrine said that sufficient courage and discipline could overcome any defensive position. That spirit could triumph over firepower. That the bayonet charge was the decisive moment of battle. The doctrine was wrong. The men died. Scheibert returned to Prussia in late 1863 with his reports and observations. He'd seen the future of warfare. Defensive positions reinforced by rifled weapons and field fortifications. Battles lasting days or weeks instead of hours. Cavalry reduced to reconnaissance because charging into rifle fire was suicide. Artillery forced to fire from longer ranges. Soldiers instinctively seeking cover and digging in. He tried to explain this to the Prussian General Staff. He really did. But there was a problem. Everything he was describing contradicted what Prussia's military believed about war. And Prussia was about to prove itself right, at least temporarily, in a way that would overshadow everything Scheibert had witnessed in America. While Scheibert was trying to convince Prussia to take American lessons seriously, François Ferri-Pisani was having the same frustrating conversation with the French military establishment. Ferri-Pisani had focused his observations on the Union Army's organization, logistics, and soldier quality. What he found both impressed and worried him. He'd watched the Union transform from a tiny professional army of about 16,000 men in 1861 to a massive force of over 500,000 by 1863. He'd seen state militias, volunteers, and eventually conscripts formed into effective fighting units in a matter of months. This shouldn't have been possible according to European military theory. Building an effective army required years of drill, training, and discipline instilled by professional officers and NCOs. The Union had neither the officers nor the time. Yet somehow they were creating an army that fought effectively. Ferri-Pisani identified why. The average Union soldier was more educated than his European counterpart. America had higher literacy rates and more public education. Soldiers could read manuals, understand orders, and make independent decisions. They didn't need to be drilled into automatons because they could think for themselves. The officers were learning on the job, certainly. Many early Union generals were incompetent, but the system was flexible enough to promote based on results rather than aristocratic birth. Incompetent generals were replaced. Effective ones were promoted. By 1863, the Union had developed a genuinely competent officer corps from almost nothing. This terrified Ferri-Pisani, not because it was bad, but because of what it meant for European armies. France's army was built on the assumption that future wars would be fought by professional soldiers led by career officers from aristocratic families. But Ferri-Pisani had watched America demonstrate that you could raise, train, and field an effective citizen army in months if the political will existed, which meant that future European wars might not be limited conflicts between professional armies. They might be total wars involving entire populations, wars where mobilization and industrial capacity mattered more than professional military excellence. Wars where millions of men would be thrown into combat with minimal training. And if that happened, European tactics designed for professional armies would fail catastrophically against the firepower of modern weapons. Ferri-Pisani saw this firsthand at the Battle of Cold Harbor in June 1864. He was observing with the Union Army of the Potomac when General Ulysses S. Grant ordered an assault on Confederate fortifications. The Confederates had dug elaborate fortifications, trenches, firing positions, reinforced with logs and earth, artillery positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. It was a position that couldn't be taken by frontal assault, at least not without devastating casualties. Grant ordered the assault anyway. At 4:30 in the morning on June 3rd, 3 Union corps advanced across open ground toward the Confederate lines. The attack lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, approximately 7,000 Union soldiers were casualties. Some units lost half their men in the opening volleys. Entire regiments pinned down in the open, unable to advance or retreat. Men digging shallow scrapes in the ground with their hands and bayonets because standing up meant death. Grant called off further assaults by 7 a.m. He'd later write in his memoirs that Cold Harbor was the only attack he ever regretted ordering. Ferri-Pisani watched the aftermath. Wounded men lying in no man's land between the lines. Neither side could retrieve them without being shot. It took 3 days to arrange a truce to collect the dead and wounded. Most of the wounded had died by then. He wrote in his report that this was the future of battle between equally equipped modern armies, not the quick, decisive engagements of Napoleonic warfare, not cavalry charges and bayonet assaults, just soldiers with modern rifles shooting at each other from prepared positions, with casualty rates that would have been considered catastrophic in any European battle. He tried to tell the French military that their tactics needed to change, that the offensive à outrance, the all-out offensive that French military doctrine celebrated, would result in exactly what happened at Cold Harbor. Massive casualties for minimal gain. No one wanted to hear it. French military culture was built around the offensive spirit, elan, audacity, the idea that superior morale and aggressive tactics could overcome defensive firepower. Cold Harbor suggested otherwise, but accepting that meant rejecting decades of French military tradition. Besides, Ferri-Pisani's warnings were about to be overshadowed by events in Europe that seemed to prove the traditional approach still worked. If you're finding this history fascinating, drop a like to help the channel. Takes a second and makes a real difference. Now, let's see what Henry Fletcher witnessed and why his warnings might have been the most important of all. Henry Fletcher arrived in America in 1864, later than the other observers, but at a crucial time. The war had evolved. Both armies had learned from 3 years of brutal experience. What Fletcher witnessed was warfare that had adapted to industrial-age weapons, and it looked nothing like European battle. Fletcher's mission from the British War Office was straightforward: assess the threat. Britain had nearly gone to war with the Union in 1861 over the Trent Affair. Border tensions with Canada were ongoing. If war came, could the Union Army conquer British North America before reinforcements arrived from Britain? Fletcher quickly realized the answer was yes, and that should have been the least of Britain's concerns. He spent months with the Army of the Potomac during the siege of Petersburg. This wasn't a traditional siege of a fortified city. This was 2 field armies that had dug into the earth and were fighting a 9-month campaign from trenches that stretched for miles. Fletcher walked the trench lines. He saw the communication trenches, the reinforced, firing positions, the underground bunkers. He watched as soldiers settled into a routine of trench life, rotating between frontline positions and reserve areas. Constant sniper fire making any movement above ground dangerous. Artillery bombardments that accomplished little except destruction. He saw the future, and he recognized it. Fletcher had studied military history extensively. He knew about siege warfare, about fortifications and sapping operations. But this was different. This wasn't besieging a city. This was field armies unable to maneuver because the defensive firepower was too strong, so they dug in and settled for stalemate. The Battle of the Crater in July 1864 crystallized Fletcher's concerns. Union forces tunneled under Confederate lines and detonated 4 tons of gunpowder, creating a massive crater. Then they attacked into the crater and the Confederate trenches beyond. The attack failed catastrophically. Confederate forces recovered quickly and turned the crater into a killing ground. Union soldiers trapped in the crater were shot down. Nearly 4,000 Union casualties for no gain. Fletcher wrote detailed reports on what he'd witnessed. But unlike Scheibert and Ferri-Pisani, Fletcher didn't just describe battles. He analyzed systems. He studied Union logistics and was amazed. The Union was supplying armies hundreds of miles from their bases using railroads and steamships. They'd built a military supply system that could feed, clothe, arm, and equip 500,000 men in the field continuously. Nothing in Europe came close to this scale or efficiency. He examined Union industry and saw factories mass-producing rifles, artillery, ammunition, uniforms, boots, wagons, everything an army needed. The industrial capacity to sustain total war. He interviewed officers and enlisted men and discovered what Ferri-Pisani had noted. The Democratic Army learned faster than professional armies. Junior officers had more initiative. Soldiers adapted tactics. Instinctively. The whole system was more flexible than Europe's rigid hierarchies. All of this led Fletcher to conclusions that made him deeply unpopular in the British military establishment. First, future wars would be total wars, not limited conflicts. Industrial nations could mobilize entire populations. Millions of men could be raised, equipped, and thrown into battle. Professional armies would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Second, these citizen armies would be more effective than Europe expected. Education and initiative mattered more than drill. Democratic armies could adapt and learn faster than aristocratic ones. Third, defensive firepower had fundamentally changed warfare. Frontal assaults on prepared positions would fail with devastating casualties. Future wars would be fought from trenches and fortifications, not in open-field battles. Fourth, Britain's all-volunteer professional army was perfect for colonial wars, but unsuited for total war against another industrial power. If Britain had to fight such a war, it would need universal military training to prepare the population. Fifth, military education needed to be democratized. Officers should be trained at institutions like West Point based on merit, not aristocratic birth. The gentleman amateur officer was obsolete. Fletcher published these conclusions in his book, History of the American War, and in numerous reports to the War Office. He argued passionately for mandatory military service, comprehensive officer training, and modern tactics. The British military establishment rejected almost everything he said. The idea of conscription was politically impossible. Democratizing the officer corps threatened the social order, and adopting defensive tactics contradicted the offensive spirit that British military culture celebrated. More importantly, events in Europe were about to convince everyone that Fletcher, Ferri-Pisani, and Scheibert were wrong about everything. In 1866, Prussia went to war with Austria. Helmuth von Moltke, chief of the Prussian General Staff, used railways to mobilize and concentrate Prussian forces faster than Austria could respond. At the Battle of Königgrätz, Prussia decisively defeated Austria in a single day of fighting. The war lasted 7 weeks, quick, decisive. exactly what European military theory predicted. Then, in 1870, Prussia went to war with France. Again, Moltke used railways and superior organization to outmaneuver the French. A series of quick battles destroyed French field armies. Within 6 weeks, the French emperor was captured, and the main French army was besieged. Paris held out for months, but the war was effectively over. Another quick, decisive Prussian victory. These wars seemed to prove that European methods still worked. Professional armies, superior staff work, offensive tactics, and railways could win quick victories. The American Civil War was an aberration, a conflict between amateur armies in difficult terrain. The lessons didn't apply to Europe. Justus Scheibert had returned to Prussia and watched his warnings be vindicated, then dismissed. Yes, he'd been right that modern weapons made frontal assaults more costly. Prussian casualties at Königgrätz had been higher than expected, but Prussia won anyway through superior organization and aggressive tactics. His detailed reports on American field fortifications and defensive warfare were filed away. Interesting, perhaps, but not relevant to European conditions. Prussia's victories proved that offensive spirit could still overcome defensive firepower. Scheibert tried to argue that Austria and France weren't fully industrialized, that they hadn't adapted to modern weapons the way the Americans had. But Prussia's success spoke louder than his warnings. François Ferri-Pisani watched France collapse in 1870 and saw everything he'd feared. France's offensive doctrine led to disaster. French armies attacked aggressively and were destroyed, piecemeal by better organized Prussian forces. The famous French élan accomplished nothing except casualties. But the official French military analysis blamed defeat on insufficient offensive spirit, poor leadership, and bad luck, not on fundamental problems with French tactical doctrine. The lesson France drew was that they needed to attack even more aggressively next time. Ferri-Pisani's warnings about defensive firepower and trench warfare were ignored. The army even dismissed his observations about citizen armies being effective. France introduced conscription after 1870, but treated conscripts as inferior to professional soldiers, requiring rigid discipline rather than initiative. Henry Fletcher had the most frustrating experience. The British military read his reports, acknowledged that his observations were accurate, and then changed almost nothing. Britain did establish the Royal Military College of Canada in 1876, partially based on Fletcher's recommendations. But domestic military reform stalled. No conscription, no comprehensive officer training system, no serious revision of tactics. The British Army remained a small, all-volunteer professional force organized for colonial warfare. Brave, well-disciplined, completely unprepared for industrial-age total war. Fletcher continued arguing for reform until his retirement. He watched British forces struggle in colonial conflicts like the Boer War and repeated his warnings. Some reforms were implemented, but nothing fundamental changed. All three men, Scheibert, Ferri-Pisani, and Fletcher, spent the rest of their careers as Cassandras. They'd seen the future. They'd tried to warn their governments. And they'd been proven wrong, at least temporarily, by European wars that were still quick and decisive. The American Civil War became a historical curiosity, interesting certainly, but not relevant to modern European warfare. The reports were filed away, the lessons forgotten, and then came 1914, OWAC. August 22, 1914, the French army attacked German positions in the Battle of the Frontiers. French soldiers advanced in dense formations, wearing bright blue coats and red trousers, attacking aggressively in accordance with their doctrine of offensive outrance. German machine guns and artillery cut them down. In a single day, 27,000 French soldiers died. By the end of August, France had suffered over 300,000 casualties. The same pattern repeated across the front. Attacking forces suffered, devastating casualties trying to assault prepared defensive positions. Cavalry charges were slaughtered by machine gun fire. Frontal infantry assaults failed with losses that would have been unthinkable in 1870. Within weeks, the war of movement had stopped. Both sides dug trenches from the Swiss border to the English Channel, a continuous line of fortifications that would barely move for 4 years. The Western Front had become Petersburg writ large. Justus Scheibert was 80 years old when World War I began. He was too old to fight, but he lived to see his predictions from 1863 come horrifically true. The trench warfare he'd witnessed at Petersburg, the indecisive battles, the massive casualties from attacking prepared positions. He died in 1915, having watched Germany commit the same errors he'd warned about 50 years earlier. François Ferri-Pisani had died in 1888, but his son served in the French army in World War I. Everything the father had predicted came to pass. Total war, involving entire populations, citizen armies numbering millions, defensive firepower making frontal assaults suicidal, trenches and fortifications defining the battlefield. French casualties in the first month of World War I exceeded their total casualties in the entire Franco-Prussian War. The offensive doctrine that had rejected Ferri-Pisani's warnings led to a generation of French soldiers being fed into machine guns. Henry Fletcher died in 1892. He didn't live to see the Great War, but his predictions were vindicated with terrible precision. Britain entered the war with a small professional army that was quickly depleted. The nation had to raise citizen armies from a population with no military training. Millions of men were given minimal preparation and sent to the trenches. British casualties on the first day of the Somme in 1916, nearly 60,000, exceeded total British casualties in most 19th-century wars. The same mistakes Fletcher had warned about. The same tactics that had failed at Cold Harbor applied on an industrial scale. The most tragic part? The information was there. The reports existed. Scheibert's observations on defensive firepower and field fortifications, Ferri-Pisani's warnings about total war, Fletcher's analysis of trench warfare and citizen armies. All of it filed away and forgotten, overshadowed by European wars that seemed to prove the old ways still worked, until they didn't. By 1918, all the major powers had learned the lessons the American observers had tried to teach in the 1860s. Infantry advanced in loose formations using cover. Attacks were preceded by massive artillery bombardments. Defenders used elaborate trench systems and fortifications. Cavalry had been relegated to reconnaissance. Frontal assaults on prepared positions were recognized as futile. Everything Scheibert, Ferri-Pisani, and Fletcher had witnessed and reported 50 years earlier. The cost of learning those lessons in 1914 instead of 1865? Approximately 40 million casualties. So what happened? Why did Europe ignore warnings from men who accurately predicted the future of warfare? Partly it was about Europe's self-image. The American Civil War was fought by amateur armies in a distant, uncivilized land. Surely professional European armies with centuries of military tradition couldn't learn from American civilians playing soldier. Partly it was timing. The Prussian victories of 1866 and 1870 seemed to prove that European methods still worked. Quick, decisive wars won by superior organization and aggressive tactics. The American experience looked like an aberration. Partly it was cultural. Accepting the observer's warnings meant rejecting fundamental aspects of military culture. The offensive spirit, cavalry charges, aristocratic officers, the glory of battle. European militaries weren't just armies. They were institutions that upheld social order. Changing military doctrine meant changing society, but mostly it was human nature. The observers were telling Europe something it didn't want to hear. That war had changed, that the next major conflict would be long, brutal, and devastating. That industrial technology had made warfare horrific in new ways. It's easier to believe that your traditions will prevail, that spirit will overcome firepower, that the next war will be like the last war, only better. It's harder to accept that everything has changed, and you need to change with it. 3 men saw the future and tried to warn us. We didn't listen. And when the future arrived anyway, it arrived with machine guns and poison gas and artillery bombardments that turned battlefields into moonscapes. The observers who saw it coming were vindicated. But vindication is cold comfort when it comes 50 years too late, paid for with millions of lives. History had tried to teach Europe a lesson in the fields of Virginia and Pennsylvania. Europe refused to learn until it had no choice. Sometimes, the most important prophecies are the ones we refuse to believe until it's too late. And that's the story of the observers who saw World War I coming 50 years before it happened. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. These deep dives take real work, and knowing there are people who stick around for the full story makes it worthwhile. If you enjoyed this, subscribe to the channel. There's a new historical deep dive every week, always about the stories and perspectives you won't find in textbooks. Next week, we're looking at another prediction that came true in the worst way possible. The economists who predicted the Great Depression and what happened when they tried to prevent it. It's another story of prophets without honor. We're almost at 1,000 subscribers. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is a great time. Hit that button. Leave a comment. Did you know about these observers? Are there other historical warnings that were ignored? I read every comment. Until next time.